The Book of Chronicles in Hebrew, Words of the Days, is a book in the Hebrew Bible, found in two books, 1st and 2nd Chronicles in the Christian Old Testament. Chronicles is the last book of the Hebrew Bible, concluding the third section of the Hebrew Tanakh, Ketuvim, meaning writings. It contains a genealogy beginning with Adam and a history of ancient Judah and Israel down to the Edict of Cyrus in 539 before Christ. The book was translated into Greek and divided into two books in the Septuagint in the mid-3rd century before Christ. In the Christian context, Chronicles is called in the plural books of Chronicles, after the Latin name chronikon given to the text by Jerome, but is also called by its Greek name Books of Chronicles. In Christian Bibles, they usually follow the two books of Kings and precede Ezra and Nehemiah, the last historical book of the Protestant Old Testament. The narrative in Chronicles begins with Adam, Seth, and Enosh, and then the story progresses, almost entirely through genealogical lists, to the founding of the United Kingdom of Israel in the introductory chapters, 1 Chronicles 1-9. Most of the rest of 1 Chronicles, after a brief account of Saul in chapter 10, is devoted to the reign of David. The next long section deals with David's son, Solomon, and the final section is devoted to the kingdom of Judah, with occasional references to the northern kingdom of Israel, 2 Chronicles 10-36. The final chapter briefly covers the reigns of the last 4 kings until Judah is destroyed and the people are taken into exile in Babylon. In the last 2 verses, identical to the opening verses of the book of Ezra, the Persian king Cyrus the Great conquers the Neo-Babylonian Empire and authorizes the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem and the return of the exiles. The Book of Chronicles was originally a single work. It was later divided into 2 in the Septuagint. The 2 books have 3 main divisions. The genealogies in chapters 1-9 of 1 Chronicles, the reigns of David and Solomon, making up the rest of 1 Chronicles, and chapters 1-9 of 2 Chronicles, and the narrative of the divided kingdom, focusing on the kingdom of Judah, in the rest of 2 Chronicles. Within this broad structure, there are indications that the author used various other devices to structure his work, notably by drawing parallels between David and Solomon, the former becoming king, establishing the worship of the God of Israel in Jerusalem, and waging the wars that would allow the building of the temple, then Solomon becoming king, building and dedicating the temple, and reaping the fruits of prosperity and peace. 1 Chronicles is divided into 29 chapters, and 2 Chronicles into 36 chapters. Bible commentator C.J. Abel suggests that the division into 2 books, introduced by the translators of the Septuagint, occurs at the most appropriate place, namely, at the end of the reign of David and the beginning of the reign of Solomon. The Talmud considered Chronicles to be one book. The last events recorded in Chronicles occurred during the reign of Cyrus the Great, the Persian king who conquered Babylon in 539 before Christ, which makes this passage in the book the earliest possible date. Chronicles appears to be largely the work of one man. The author was likely a male, possibly a Levite, temple priest, and probably from Jerusalem. He was a learned, skilled editor, and sophisticated theologian. His goal was to use the narratives of the Torah and previous prophets to convey religious messages to his peers, the literary and political elite of Jerusalem during the Achaemenid Empire. Jewish and Christian tradition identify this author as the 5th century before Christ. Figure Ezra, who gives his name to the Book of Ezra. Talmudic scholars also believe that Ezra wrote both his own book, Ezra and Nehemiah, and Chronicles by his own time, the latter being completed by Nehemiah. Later critics, skeptical of the long-held tradition, prefer to call the author the chronicler. However, many scholars maintain support for Ezra's authorship, not only on the basis of centuries of work by Jewish historians, but also because of the consistency of linguistic and speech patterns between Chronicles and Ezra, Nehemiah. Professor Emeritus Menachem Haran of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem explains, the overall unity of the Chronicle is demonstrated by a common ideology, the uniformity of legal, cultic, and historical concepts, and the specific style, all of which reflect a single opus. One of the most striking, if unconvincing, features of Chronicles is that the closing sentence is repeated as at the beginning of Ezra, Nehemiah. In ancient times, similar repeated verses, like the closing lines used by modern printers, often appeared at the end of a scroll to make it easier for the reader to move on to the correct second scroll after completing the first. This scribal device was used in works that exceeded the scope of one scroll and had to be continued on another scroll. The second half of the 20th century, amid growing academic skepticism about the historical record in the biblical tradition, has seen a re-examination of the question of authorship. Despite a general lack of corroborating evidence, many now consider it unlikely that the author of Chronicles was also the author of the narrative portions of Ezra, Nehemiah. These critics suggest that Chronicles was probably written between 400 and 250 before Christ, with 350 to 300 before Christ being the most likely. This time range is arrived at by estimates made on the basis of genealogies appearing in the Greek Septuagint. This theory bases its premise on the last person mentioned in Chronicles, Hanani. Hanani was an 8th-generation descendant of King Jehoiakim according to the Masoretic text. This has convinced many supporters of the Septuagint interpretation to place the probable date of Ananias' birth a century later than what has been widely accepted for 2 millennia. Much of the content of Chronicles is a repetition of material from other books of the Bible, from Genesis to Kings, and so the usual scholarly opinion is that these books, or an early version of them, provided the author with most of his material. However, it is possible that the situation was much more complex, and that books such as Genesis and Samuel were seen as contemporary with Chronicles, drawing on much of the same material, rather than as a source for it. Despite much discussion on this issue, no consensus has been reached. It is also possible that Chronicles preserved ancient heterodox traditions concerning the history of Israel. The translators who produced the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint, called this book paralipomenon, things omitted, indicating that they considered it to be a supplement to another work, probably Genesis, Kings, but the idea seems inappropriate, since much of Genesis, Kings was copied almost unchanged. Some modern scholars suggest that Chronicles is a midrash, or traditional Jewish commentary, on Genesis, Kings, but again this is not entirely accurate, since the author or authors did not comment on the older books, but used them to create a new work. Recent suggestions are that it was intended as an explanation of the story in Genesis, Kings, or as a substitute or alternative to it. Presbyterian theologian Paul Hooker argues that the common message the author intended to convey to his audience was a theological reflection, not a history of Israel. God is active in history, and especially in the history of Israel. The faithfulness or sins of individual kings are immediately rewarded or punished by God. This is in contrast to the theology of the books of Kings, where the unfaithfulness of the kings was punished for later generations by the Babylonian captivity. God calls Israel into a special relationship. The call begins with genealogies, gradually narrowing the focus from all of humanity to a single family, the Israelites, the descendants of Jacob. The true Israel are those who continue to worship Yahweh in the temple in Jerusalem, in the southern kingdom of Judah, with the result that the history of the historical kingdom of Israel is almost completely ignored. God chose David and his dynasty to carry out his will. According to the author of Chronicles, the three great events of David's reign were the bringing of the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, the founding of an eternal royal dynasty, and his preparation for the construction of the temple. God chose a site in Jerusalem for the temple, the place where we were to worship God before the coming of Christ. More time and space are devoted to the construction of the temple and its rituals of worship than to any other topic. While emphasizing the centrality of the temple in pre-exilic Judea, the author also emphasizes the importance of the newly rebuilt Second Temple of the Persian era to his readers. God remains active in Israel. The past is used to legitimize the author's present. This is most clearly seen in the detailed attention he pays to the temple built by Solomon, but also in the genealogy and lineage that connect his own generation to the distant past and thus claim that the present is a continuation of that past. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the Moses Film channel and give the video a thumbs up in support.